Welcome to Writer's Corner. Today, Doug Stewart with The Boy Who Would Be Shakespeare, a tale of forgery and folly. Hello, Doug.
Hi, Joe.
Welcome to WinCAM.
It's my pleasure to be here.
This book looks like a lot of work. Was it?
Well, I guess it was long. It was 14 times longer than anything I'd ever written before, because I'm a magazine writer until now.
So this is your first?
My first book, that's right.
And it's not historical fiction, it's actually historical fact.
That's right. It's a true story. I didn't make anything up.
But what's great is on the back of the book, I'm going to read the quote if you don't mind. Doug Stewart shows how popular history writing is done. His superbly written account of boy forger William Henry Ireland's ill-fated stab at literary immortality is as entertaining and poignant as a good novel. Clifford Irving, author of The Hoax and the autobiography of Howard Hughes. Well, Clifford Irving knows a few things about hoaxes.
That's right.
How'd you get him? Let's start there.
Oh, it wasn't easy. I didn't actually know he was alive, and then I found an old website that he had set up, and he didn't answer his email, but there was a little name of the web designer. I got in touch with her. She was out of the country, but finally replied. One thing led to another, and I sent Clifford Irving the book, and I think he appreciated the topic, because this is perhaps a more sympathetic treatment of a forger than you often find. Mm-hmm. Since this forger is really the protagonist of the story.
But I can tell people this, that the father was obsessed with Shakespeare. That's right. Fixated, really. Right.
And this was a time when the story takes place in London 200 years ago. And the amazing thing is Shakespeare, at the end of the 1700s in England, was a god. I mean, people considered him a deity, the divine bard, but he hadn't been in his own lifetime. He had only recently become an immortal, and now, finally, people were looking for his papers and effects, and there were none. So when this boy began forging things and saying, look, I found these in an old trunk, people were delighted.
Now, over our 30 minutes, I'm going to talk about the book, but I also have a ton of Shakespeare questions. Do you mind if I throw them at you?
Yeah, if I can answer them, sure.
Okay. I've read that Shakespeare took a lot from the Bible, mm-hmm. and that there's a lot of biblical references in Shakespeare's work. Is that correct?
Oh, sure. Because everybody would have learned to read in Shakespeare's time in order to read the Bible. In fact, women weren't even taught to write. They were only taught to read, typically, in Shakespeare's time. They were taught to read so they could read the Bible. More than that, women didn't need to do.
Which is a huge text rich with all sorts of language. So Shakespeare, being the premier kind of writer, if you will, of modern times, people are drawing from Shakespeare today. So they're kind of drawing from the Bible, correct?
Right, and also there were other great writers in Shakespeare's time who put together the King James Bible. And that was during Shakespeare's lifetime. And in fact, you could say some of those writers might have been rivals of Shakespeare. 200 years later, he was the unrivaled bard, but in his lifetime, he had plenty of rivals. So one of the ways in which people can enjoy and get a lot out of the Bible today is how well the King James Version is written.
And I'm setting up the foundation for our interview with some questions on Shakespeare, then we'll go back to the book. In modern times, before the age of concerts going up on the internet, people were recording classical concerts maybe 40, 50 years ago, maybe later. And then rock and roll concerts. There's a whole thing on the web now of people trading tapes. Shakespeare's works were transcribed from the audience, correct?
What do you mean transcribed from the audience?
Fans would be going to see these plays which were much like this is my interpretation as a non-reader of Shakespeare. But I've heard that fans were happy with these plays, which were kind of like soap operas for that time. So they would go and write them down.
I see what you mean.
They would transcribe them as they were.
The Shakespeare's plays were really considered passing entertainments when he wrote them, like soap operas. And who would buy a script to a soap opera? Even if they enjoyed the play, nobody thought to collect the script. Once the script was given to the prompter, and the prompter would write down the prompt book, you'd throw the script away. And once the play was printed, if it was printed, you'd throw the manuscript away. But by the time Shakespeare died, half of his plays had never been printed. They weren't collected until 7 years after he died in the first folio. In order to compile that with about 35 plays, Shakespeare's friends had to round up people, not audience members, but actors really, who had played parts in plays years before. And they'd say, okay, now recite your part from memory. And that's why there are so many different versions of Shakespeare's plays, because the actor's memory was faulty. The earliest version of Hamlet is a little sort of paperback from about 1603, 1604, printed. There are no manuscripts, no handwritten versions. And it says, "To be or not to be? Aye, there's the point." Can that be right? Maybe. Nobody knows, because nobody has Shakespeare's version. It could be the actor was recalling that that's what he said 10 years before, or even he was recalling what some other actor said. So it causes a lot of confusion.
So this urban legend I've heard that people in the audience were transcribing.
Well, to steal stuff. Shakespeare would do that.
Oh,
yeah. As soon as something was performed, it was fair game. There were no copyright laws.
Oh.
So other people in the theater room, in the theater world, maybe not in the audience, but in the wings, would, they would write down to steal stuff. Stealing, it wasn't even stealing. There was no concept of plagiarism. They'd just take what they wanted. Sometimes what Shakespeare would write would be a rewrite of a play that had been staged 10 years earlier. He didn't even wait.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's something that I did not realize.
Well, it's like the blues. I mean, it would have been considered okay. You know, you take a song, Sitting on Top of the World, you do it 10 years later, you put your own spin on it, and maybe the original artist is unhappy, but the public figures, cool, I like that better.
So it brings us to this individual, Mr. Ireland, who's obsessed and fixated with Shakespeare, much like other people in his day.
Right. He was very much a man of his time. And he was also not just a Shakespeare worshiper, he was a collector. And those two things together are where he got into trouble. Collecting was a fad at in the 18th century, where people wanted to assemble a sort of cabinet of curiosities, of various rare things from history, to show everybody that they were, had a proper reverence for the past. And one of the most valuable things that people would collect would be old books and manuscripts. And Samuel Ireland, the forger's father, was somebody who wanted more than anything to own something that Shakespeare had written. He had a first folio, which is this first edition from 1623, and that was perhaps the most valuable thing he owned. But still, even a first folio was a mass-produced object, and he wanted something unique, and that's something that Shakespeare himself had written.
And what year is this set in, approximately?
1790s, 1794, 1795, 1796.
So we're talking about 180, 190 years after Shakespeare.
Right, and right after the American Revolution, King George III is still the king, and Shakespeare had been dead since 1616. And for a century he had been in eclipse, but now he's back. And he is the most popular playwright in London. His plays are being performed constantly, partly because all the actors and actresses knew the parts. They didn't have to learn new lines. But it's what audiences wanted. And they wanted more and more. So this is another exciting thing here. To have something new appear was very crowd-pleasing.
It's kind of like Edgar Allan Poe. It's really tragic that they didn't realize how powerful their words were. Poe and Shakespeare never experienced what the world would do.
Well, that's possible. I don't know. It's hard to imagine what it would have been like to be Shakespeare. If somebody had called him a genius, he might have laughed. Other people would have laughed. Ben Jonson was a rival and friend who also was writing plays at the same time. And Jonson himself compiled his own works while he was alive, and he called them the works of Ben Jonson. And people in the theater world and poets made fun of him for that, for having the audacity to call his plays works, as though they were literature. In that day, it wasn't. It was not like a soap opera, but it was, these were ephemera. These were things that would be popular at one point, and then the play would have its run, and then it'd be forgotten. And you're on to the next thing. And if somebody had said Shakespeare was a god, that would have been blasphemy.
Now, the fine line is there's no copyright law.
Right.
But 180, 90 years later, someone's not plagiarizing, but forging.
Right.
Which is a shade. Well, it's crossing the line.
Yeah. I think the boy, when he started forging, had a role model in his mind, which was a boy named Thomas Chatterton, who had forged poetry supposedly written by a medieval monk in English. He wrote it with watered-down ink on parchment. And the poetry, when he showed it to people, was widely praised. It's still in print, even. And Chatterton wasn't happy to have his forged stuff praised. He wanted to write things under his own name. So he moved to London and tried to make a living as a writer and as a poet, and he couldn't get his things published, and he drank arsenic and died. And he was 17 years old.
Whoa.
Yeah. And so William Henry Ireland, who was Samuel's son, William Henry was the forger, he was a teenager, and he didn't think he was doing anything worse than what Chatterton had done. The difference was Chatterton was forging fake old-fashioned poetry by someone no one had ever heard of. William Henry Ireland was faking poetry and plays by William Shakespeare, the greatest writer in the history of English literature, which is definitely not quite so excusable.
It is, but you know, it's like it's a kid. It's kind of, right. You know, and and as you point out, he's looking for his father's attention.
Exactly. He started out, it was a combination of trying to win his father's love and approval and respect, and maybe even outdoing his father, who was a frustrated playwright himself, and also playing a prank, because in school he had been a terrible student. He'd failed at a string of private schools, probably stopped his education around 14, and he'd often gotten in trouble in school and been caned by the headmasters and so on. And I think this was one more prank at first. It was sort of a combination of a prank on his father and also trying to win his father's loves. I think the tortured relationship between this boy and his father is sort of the engine driving the story. But then, as he kept writing, his motivation changed. Once people started accepting these things as real, he started imagining that he was a second Shakespeare.
Now, I'm going to go back to the back of your book. Joseph Finder, New York Times bestselling author of Vanished in Paranoia, says, a fascinating tale of forgery, greed, and deception. It's the Catch Me If You Can of 18th century London, gripping, fast-moving, and funny. Catch Me If You Can, the criminal forger, turned out to be able to help the authorities.
Right.
Despite the fact that he used his energies in a negative way, there's no doubt the man was extremely gifted.
Right.
Is the young man here in this story, would you say that he was extremely gifted? Even though he had failed so much in school?
Right. He was definitely a classic underachiever. He was a whole lot more gifted than his teachers ever thought. And he was a whole lot more gifted than his father noticed. But as far as unusually gifted, he was not a second Shakespeare. And in fact, unlike the man in Catch Me If You Can, it's true, both people started their escapades when they were very young. And I forget the name of the man who wrote the story of Catch Me If You Can.
Yeah, Leonardo DiCaprio played the character.
Right. But he very soon turned and became, he's now, I think, head of his own detective agency, and he's consulted to the FBI. And probably by the time he was in his late 20s, he was on the straight and narrow. And I think one big difference here is this boy was he was experiencing in part a sort of cultural clash between the young romantic poets who were just starting to write in the 1790s, like Wordsworth and Coleridge, who disdained the earlier classical poetry of the century. People like Alexander Pope were very witty and careful, but followed rules. And the romantic poets believed in personal experience. And I think really this bizarre relationship, and it was partly he didn't accept the literary establishment, who would never publish him if he tried to be a poet or a playwright. So he had to do something different. He had to put one over on the establishment, you know, stick it to the man. You could say he did that. And I don't think that changed. He continued to look at the experts he fooled as the real imposters. They said they knew Shakespeare. Obviously, they didn't.
Well, it's kind of like how you value art, you know. Do you really pay $50 million for a piece of artwork? It's all what someone decides they're going to put that money up, and then all of a sudden there's a value on something.
It's exactly the issue. It's sort of like going into an art museum. You know, do you look at the wall panel before you look at the painting, or do you just look at the painting and decide whether you like it or not? Most people, and I confess me too, you look at the wall panel and then you see if it's something famous or by somebody famous. And in Shakespeare's case, people will say, well, can't you tell if something's by Shakespeare? As though his genius is sort of wafting off the paper. You can just tell that this godlike being put these words together. You know, that's ridiculous. And I think we use Shakespeare as a handy brand name, unthinkingly, as a synonym for literary creativity. The way we do with Mozart. You know, Mozart means great music, Leonardo art, Einstein science, but do we know Shakespeare? I mean, how many people have read or seen performed King John, or read The Rape of Lucrece, which he was better known for in his lifetime than any of his plays? And it's hard to get through. I mean, it's turgid. It's a poem about a rape. The run-up to the rape, and then the aftermath. It's overwritten, it's really long, and people don't read it today. But people still talk about Shakespeare as though, well, you should be able to identify anything he wrote because it's going to all be so brilliant. And, you know, that's never the case.
And we do have to wonder, you know, did he really write it all?
Well, that's true.
That's a big question, too.
Well, it's a big question. I have to say, I don't think too many or any mainstream, tenured English professors or historians of the English Renaissance have any question. You know, they are what you call Stratfordians. But I think a lot of people are bothered by the fact that so little is known about Shakespeare. So little is known about his life, and there's evidence that he wasn't terribly, he wasn't put on a pedestal while he was alive. And that bothers the average Shakespeare admirer today. And so you look for another explanation. Well, maybe he didn't write the plays. Maybe somebody else did. But I don't think it's necessary to look for that other explanation.
And I like how you've gone into the whole legend and came up with this important work, because Shakespeare is so important, and now people have this kind of look at what his work created, kind of like a...
And also, if it hadn't been for the mystery, or the complete not complete, but the huge gaps in Shakespeare's biography, not only would you not have this authorship controversy about who wrote Shakespeare, but this forger wouldn't have had this opportunity to fill in the gaps, because he didn't just forge works of Shakespeare. He started out with, you know, a deed just signed by Shakespeare, and then little papers like an expense receipt or a letter, and then eventually he wrote a full-length play, and then a second full-length play. But more than that, he was filling in biographical details that England in the late 1700s wanted to hear, such as a love letter to Shakespeare's wife. Until now, there was no evidence that Shakespeare loved his wife. He lived in London, she lived in Stratford. That doesn't sound too good. He left her his second best bed in his will. That doesn't sound too good.
No, not at all.
And now here's this love letter and a poem that rhymes, and also when he forged other things, he used to write first drafts of plays by taking a printed version and copying it out in longhand on old paper with diluted ink, and then say, look, I found the first draft also in this old trunk at an anonymous gentleman's home. And when he would transcribe the plays, he'd leave out the dirty parts. And then people would think, oh, great, we always knew Shakespeare was a much more refined writer than the printers would have us believe. They must have added that stuff later to sell copies.
Doug, when did you get the idea to put this together?
Well, I knew about this story. I found out about it when I was researching an article for Smithsonian Magazine, which I've written for since the 1980s, just a few years ago, and it was about the authorship controversy. And I hadn't realized how little was known about Shakespeare until I started digging into that subject. And I also found out how often people have tried to supply their own information about Shakespeare, not usually forgeries, but trying to sort of promote legends into the truth, like that Shakespeare was a fun-loving guy who would go drinking and he poached deer and did all these other things that are just based on legends. And then I found out about this as part of Shakespeare's amazing afterlife. It's his afterlife in which he became a real star. And I think this is better known in England than here. At the time these forgeries happened, both before, during the run-up to the scandal and in the aftermath, this was a sensational news in London. Everyone knew about these papers. It was publicly debated whether they were authentic or not. Lots of people wrote about them in their memoirs and in diaries. The newspapers did articles. But it's been forgotten since then, and I think to a large extent because people assumed later that he was just this criminal who threatened Shakespeare's legacy. And that's not true. He never went to jail. He wasn't tried for anything, and I think Shakespeare was safe all along.
Yeah. It's interesting that the works haven't kind of like filtered into, that no one's gone and done a movie on one of the forged plays, you know?
Or on,
or even a TV movie.
Yeah. The play he wrote two, but the main one that was actually staged in London is called Vortigern and Rowena. It sounds like a ridiculous name, but it's taken from Holinshed's Chronicles, which was a book of tales and legends and history of England from the 1500s that Shakespeare himself drew on in writing his history plays. If Shakespeare had lived longer, he might have written Vortigern and Rowena. And it was actually, it was performed in 1796 in London, and some in the audience thought it was a Shakespearean premiere, some didn't. And it was standing room only, thousands turned away.
Of course.
The streets around the theater were mobbed, but it was actually produced 200 years later. It was produced in London in 1997.
Okay.
Yeah. And it played for, I think, about a month, which isn't bad.
No, not bad at all.
I understand it got bad reviews, however.
Oh.
So there you go.
How did you sell the book? Did you have an agent?
Right. This is all new to me. Since I've been a magazine writer all my life, 25 years, and the way you do that is you pitch stories to editors and you generate tons of ideas, and you just keep sending out queries. This was quite different. I just thought this was the best idea I could think of. And I'd written other history stories for Smithsonian. Okay. I often write about history and the arts, Queen Elizabeth and the destruction of Pompeii, things like that. And so I wrote a proposal and my agent shopped it around. And I think it's just a question of finding the right publisher. And my publisher really liked the idea and wanted it to be a straight-ahead narrative chronology, very much like a novel. So I do not talk about the 21st century. I don't quote any experts in direct quotes. I don't bring myself into it. It reads like a camera's running and you're seeing this nervous boy who's growing in confidence to a dysfunctional level, you could say, until he thinks he's Shakespeare reborn.
Ha.
Yeah.
Have you lived here all your life?
Well, in Massachusetts,
Yes.
yeah. I grew up in Lexington. Went to Lexington High.
Up the road.
Neighboring town, that's right. Yep.
You'll be on Lexington Cable with this.
Oh, good. And I'll be speaking at the Lexington Library later, where I did my first writing in 3rd grade in the Children's Library.
Later, today or?
No, in September.
September,
Yeah.
oh good, good.
And then I lived in Cambridge for a long time, and I've lived in Ipswich since the early 80s.
Beautiful place.
Yeah.
water and stuff, so it's a good place to write, too.
Yeah, and there are many writers there, in fact.
Now, did you have to go to London?
I did. I went to London, and one thing that was interesting is at the British Library, they have a manuscripts room, and they have a lot of documents from this case, including letters that William Henry, the boy, and his father, Samuel, wrote with a third party, Mr. H. Mr. H was the anonymous gentleman in whose trunk the boy supposedly found all these papers.
Ah.
Yeah. And the father, when the boy first produced forgeries, said, instead of being delighted, his real reaction was, where did you find these? Because wherever you found them, there must be all these other papers that everyone has been looking for, because people assumed that Shakespeare's papers couldn't have been thrown away. They must be put away for safekeeping. So the boy said, well, Mr. H has the papers and he doesn't want to be named. He wants to lie low, but you could write him a letter and I'll deliver it to him. And so he did, and then the boy forged the letter in the guise of Mr. H to his father. And the father was saying, when do I get the rest of the papers? Because Mr. H was pretending he didn't care about old papers, you can have them. And in the letter the boy forged, Mr. H ignored the father's questions and just said, oh, Mr. Ireland, you should be really proud to have a son like that. I mean, he's really a second Shakespeare, I think. Do you know he writes his own poetry? And he's working on a play about William the Conqueror? And he fooled the father. And you can read this correspondence at the British Library, and it's a bizarre experience. And the father never recognized it was his own son's handwriting, writing these letters.
And the child got the undivided attention of his dad.
For the first time. Yeah, the father thought his son was a dunce. He was condescending to him. He was ashamed of him, I think. He'd found him a job as an unpaid lawyer's clerk. Actually, an articled clerk, which means the father, Samuel, had to pay his lawyer friend to take the boy on.
Huh.
Because it wasn't hard to be a lawyer in those days. All you had to do is swear an oath denouncing the Pope. Officially. There were no LSATs, no law schools.
Wow, where do I sign up? You know, as the Oracle in the Matrix says, our time is up. Not quite. We got about 60 seconds. This is fun stuff. I'm glad you put it together.
Well, thank you.
People love Shakespeare. Now they can investigate a little bit more. And I've got to say that going to London and seeing those papers are valuable because just as historical artifacts of people, just any people from the day, I'm glad that they're preserved.
Oh, me too. It is a wonderful resource. Also, the Rare Books Library at Harvard has a lot of this stuff, which is open to the public, actually.
That's something. Maybe we'll take our cameras in there one of these days.
Oh, good luck.
Doug, a pleasure having you here.
Okay, Joe.
You're welcome back anytime, man.
Okay.
And I got to get an autograph.
Okay.
And it's Writer's Corner here at WinCAM. And Doug Stewart. Oh, and I got to say, fakeshakespeare.com. I bet that's your website.
Fakeshakespeare.com, that's right.
Fakeshakespeare.com.
You can read an excerpt and get more information and pictures.
Read an excerpt, get information and pictures. Have a good day.